You know the phrase, more fun than a barrel of monkeys? Well, it's not really true. So we dropped the K and came up with the Iowa Lottery's new scratch game, Barrels of Money. Much more fun. You can match and win up to 5 times, up to $750. Just scratch the top barrel for your number, then scratch to match the other barrels. Give Barrels of Money a try. It's definitely more fun than you know what.
Now you can get Little Caesar's Cheeser. Not 1 but 2 pieces with extra cheese and up to 3 toppings plus free crazy bread for $8.98.
Cheeser.
You're watching Channel 5.
For the first time in 12 years, no American military forces are in Vietnam. All of our American POWs are on their way home.
It was a lie, and it took 2 decades for senior Nixon aides to admit it, to a Congress pressing for answers.
I didn't ask for this job. I'm here because 20 years later, this question confounds America. And the fact is that there are people who are listed as POWs who aren't home or didn't come home, that we don't know what happened to them.
But why were Americans told a lie? And why were they so eager to believe it?
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
How can we begin to explain to those too young to have lived through it the level of mistrust, the outright antagonism that existed in 1973 between millions of Americans and the Nixon administration? Do you think relations between Congress and the White House are strained these days? In 1973, Congress was oiling the impeachment machine. It had been made more than clear to the executive branch of government that Congress was prepared to finance only one more Vietnam expedition, whatever it would take to withdraw every last American out of there. There was boiling resentment over what President Nixon had described during the '72 presidential campaign as his secret plan to end the war. By 1973, Nixon's credibility was hardly at an all-time high. If he had spoken up about missing U.S. prisoners in Laos, about cranking the war up again to force their release, it would have seemed like just another gambit to distract attention from Watergate. There's one of the great historical ironies of the period. Americans were far more prepared to believe the lie that everyone was home than the truth that some of our men may have been left behind. The unpalatable reality is that in 1973, most of us didn't have the stomach for the truth, which is why, as Jeff Greenfield reports, Senator Kerry's hearings on Vietnam MIAs is such a painful and embarrassing experience.
The hearing of the Senate Select Committee on POW-MI Affairs will come to order.
Listen closely, and you can hear the ghosts in the room.
The committee meets this morning.
You can hear the ghosts of the longest war in American history, the most divisive since the Civil War itself, the war we did not win. You can hear echoes of the last years of that war, when prospects for victory had long since faded, when those who prosecuted the war and those who opposed it were focused on one issue, the return of our imprisoned and missing men.
Can't we now stop the killing for which the United States is responsible and bring the prisoners of war home now?
John Kerry was a decorated Vietnam combat veteran who had turned against the war. Now he is Senator Kerry, chairing an investigation into how well American officials accounted for POWs and MIAs. Yesterday, high officials in the Nixon administration, including 2 former secretaries of defense, offered explosive testimony.
I have a high probability assessment that people were left behind in Laos, and a medium probability assessment with regard to Vietnam.
It was my gut feeling that there were more. When I left, I think that we felt at that time, and I think the last figures that we had were that the list of POWs probably would contain quite a few more names than that.
It was the stuff of headlines, the possibility that American officials knew they were leaving fighting men behind. Today, the man who symbolized American foreign policy in those years, the man who negotiated the Vietnam Peace Accords and who shared a Nobel Peace Prize with his North Vietnam adversary, Henry Kissinger came to the Senate committee today in an angry mood.
Leaks assert that when President Nixon announced that all prisoners were on their way home, he or his aides knew that many were left behind. That allegation is a flat-out lie.
When Kerry and Kissinger squared off, it was almost as if the passions of 2 decades ago had never ended.
I don't happen to believe that this dialogue is very helpful because it refights the Vietnam War.
Which is
and
what
I did not start
to do. I wore the uniform. I was in Vietnam, and from the day I got back here, I expressed concern about my comrades in arms.
To a generation born after Vietnam had ended, it must all seem incomprehensible. How could our leaders even contemplate leaving living Americans behind in enemy hands? But to remember the mood of 1973 is to remember a country that had almost drained itself.
In 1973, this country was exhausted by the war, sick of it, of an unpleasant, unwinnable war in a distant country that had taken about 50,000 American lives.
Years without peace, years without victory, years without unity had brought us to the point where one song seemed to sum it all up.
We gotta get out of this place. It's the last thing we ever do.
To end the war and bring peace with honor.
By early 1973, a newly re-elected President Nixon was eager to put Vietnam behind him, the better to face a domestic crisis that was growing more dangerous by the day, Watergate. For Henry Kissinger, a zealous anti-war movement and an impatient Congress had left him without any leverage in negotiating with an implacable North Vietnamese foe.
Nothing would have pleased me more than public support saying, do not withdraw so fast because you're losing your leverage. We were caught by our domestic debates.
And after 8 years of war and dissent and 50,000 dead Americans, the specter of a handful of servicemen left behind may have paled beside the urge for peace.
People who were pro-war as much as people who were anti-war by that stage said, let's get out.
But the problem was that the POWs had become the center of the Vietnam debate in the early 1970s. President Nixon said their freedom was the reason why the war was going on.
The goal that I have dedicated myself to, that I have spoken to many of you about, including to this group last year, of securing the release of our POWs and the return of our MIAs.
Vietnam foes were saying only a swift end to the war would bring them home.
I think the public is becoming increasingly aware that the president is leading them down a blind alley when he tells them that aerial bombardment will lead to the release of our prisoners.
Now, this is our 8th visit to Vietnam.
Even an American cultural icon was talking about it.
There were several proposals made, and we ended up by saying that asking for a visa so we could go to North Vietnam and see the prisoners.
At just 6 minutes after 11 a.m. local time...
And when the peace accords were signed in early 1973, President Nixon again promised to make the freedom of POWs his top concern.
All of our American POWs are on their way home. We shall insist that North Vietnam comply with the agreement. And the leaders of North Vietnam should have no doubt as to the consequences if they fail to comply with the agreement.
The prisoners' dramatic televised return seemed to be the one triumph America could take from Vietnam. Homecomings and White House dinners testified to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But what former Nixon administration officials suggested yesterday was that a war-weary nation and a Congress deeply distrustful of the president would never have accepted a decision by Nixon to confront North Vietnam over the POW issue.
Although we had strongly suggestive intelligence that the lists were incomplete. The American society would have blown apart if the president overturned the agreement and resumed the fighting.
That response is cold comfort to retired Colonel David Hackworth, the most decorated living American soldier from the Vietnam era.
The thing about the war in Vietnam will never go away until this is resolved, until we get to the bottom of this. And if the Kissingers, if the Nixons, if the Alexander Haigs are responsible for leaving Americans behind in cages in the jungle, then they should be tried for treason and lined up against a wall and shot.
For David Halberstam, history has a different judgment.
The truth about the POWs is I think the people who were in charge got the best deal they could, but they didn't have any leverage. The war was over, it was unwinnable, the country had turned on it.
Few who lived through that time will ever forget the sheer fury of the debate over Vietnam. But even fewer back then would have thought that some 20 years later, that war would still have the power to stir such passions. Yet even now, Vietnam echoes from the presidential campaign to the halls of the Senate. Maybe, like Francis Dreyfus affair, like our own Civil War, it will never lose its hold on us. I'm Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
When we come back, we'll be joined by the anti-war senator who opposed President Nixon in the election 20 years ago, George McGovern, and by a former Kissinger aide who was at the Paris peace talks, Winston Lord.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Jeep Eagle.
Well, it's here. Time for me to step down and retire as chairman of Chrysler. And hey, anybody that goes out wants to go out with a bang. And we've got a bang that'll be heard from Germany to Japan. It's a new car design that's as revolutionary as our minivan was. It's going to change the way cars are designed from now on. We call it cab forward. What we did was move the windshield forward. Then we pulled the rear wheels back, made the rear doors wider and easier to get through, and increased the width. Believe me, this does more than just improve the looks. It gives you a lot more room inside, it rides better, and it's easier to handle. I think cab forward, like our minivan, is going to get copied by everybody. It has to, just because it makes so much sense. You know, I got to tell you, when it's your last turn at bat, it sure is nice to hit a home run.
Are you inventing new ways to clean glass? Do you enjoy cleaning those hard-to-reach places? Do you wish there was a faster, easier, better way? Introducing Flip It, the glass cleaning breakthrough of our lifetime, made and patented in America. Just spray the sponge, then slide and glide. Even corners and edges come clean. Now simply flip it to buff streak free every time. Plus, moisture will not penetrate successive paper sheets. Flip It is inexpensive to use because you don't spray the glass, you spray the sponge. And Flip It uses only 1% of the paper normally used to clean glass. Now it's easy to be efficient and help save trees. Flip It comes in two models, one for the home and one for the car. And Flip It is thin and easy to store. Plus, you never throw Flip It away because the Flip It is absolutely 100% guaranteed for a lifetime. Now you can own Flip It's for only $19.95 each plus $4.50 shipping and handling.
Call 1-800-688-8939 right now to order your Flip It. It's only $19.95 plus shipping and handling. That's 1-800-688-8939.
It's us and them, the slimy world of rip-off car repairmen. Primetime's undercover cameras catch the boys under the hood. Primetime Thursday.
Winston Lord was Henry Kissinger's special assistant on the National Security Staff, leaving that post with the signing of the Paris Peace Accord in 1973. A former ambassador to China, he is now chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy. Ambassador Lord joins us in our Washington bureau. Also with us in Washington is former Senator George McGovern. He was an early and vocal opponent of the Vietnam War, whose dovish stance was the centerpiece of his 1972 presidential campaign. Why, Senator McGovern, do you think so many years later there is still such a reverberation over this issue?
Over the prisoner of war issue and,
yes,
and the MIAs, I think, Ted, it stems from the fact that that issue was elevated to one of central importance while the war was in progress. The Nixon administration particularly almost left the impression that we were in Vietnam fighting that war in order to get the prisoners out and to account for the missing in action. Let me just say that more than 40 years ago, as a pilot in the Second World War, I lost my navigator who was flying one day with another crew. He's still missing in action. We don't know what happened to him. Combat crews on both sides of me in the olive orchard where I was stationed were taken as
prisoners during the war, so my heart goes out to the people that have experienced this tragedy. But I thought 20 years ago, as I do now, that the proper way to have dealt with the problem of the POWs was to stop the war. Every day that war continued, young Americans were being seized as prisoners, they were being killed, they were being maimed, and so the decision to end the war was the right one. The decision to continue that war year after year was what produced the prisoners of war.
If indeed, however, men were left behind, then your assumption that ending the war would be the right way to bring about their release would have been proved wrong.
Well, I think that the Nixon administration probably cut the best deal they could get at the time the war came to an end. There's no question the American people had turned against the war. The Congress had turned against it. Many of our military people knew it was unwinnable. And what they knew is that if we continued that war month after month, there'd be even more prisoners of war. It's true, or at least it appears to be now, that some Americans were left behind. I didn't know that at the time. I doubt if very many other Americans knew it. I don't know any member of Congress who knew it at that time. But what we do know is that if the war had continued, or if Mr. Nixon had decided that we had to resume it again because of the fear that some Americans weren't accounted for, we know that more prisoners would have been taken, more Americans would have died. That we do know.
Ambassador Lord, you were with Henry Kissinger in Paris during those negotiations with the Vietnamese. He was negotiating with a very weak hand, wasn't he?
That's correct, and I'll get to that point, but I'd like to comment on what's already been shown and said. My heart goes out to the families of the missing in action and the anguish they've suffered for 20 years. I hope these hearings will heal some of those wounds, but respectfully, they will not be healed by the kind of media headlines we got this morning and the implication of your piece that President Nixon and others knowingly left people behind. We were suspicious of Hanoi. The lists were inadequate, but we could not be absolutely sure, and as Chairman Kerry volunteered the other day, there's never been absolute proof that a person has been left behind. There may well have been.
Let me interject.
So I think it's important to make that point.
Let me, if I may, interject on that particular note. When a former director of the CIA, who was also a former Secretary of Defense, a man of great probity and caution in his use of language, uses a term of art like a high probability assessment that men were left behind in Laos, when a man like James Schlesinger says that, I don't know what else you conclude but that people at the highest level of the Nixon administration believed that men were left behind.
He is saying that is his conclusion today. He did not say it at the time, apparently.
Well, he couldn't. I mean, what is it, if you know, please tell me, what is it you're suggesting that he has learned since then that he didn't know at the time?
You have to ask him. The point I'm making is, it is one thing to say that we made mistakes in the conduct of the war or even in the implementation of the peace, although it was wrecked by Hanoi. It's another thing to say that high American officials knowingly left specific individuals behind. If we had known, for example, that there was a Lieutenant Smith sitting in Hanoi Hilton, absolutely without question, we would have probably gone to the Congress and tried to reopen it. But the point I'm making is that there's a difference between knowingly lying and leaving people behind and having severe doubts, pursuing it vigorously, and then to get to your question, continuing to implement the agreement, because it's not only would the Congress not have supported reopening the war, as Senator McGovern has suggested, the society would have blown apart. We would not have gotten back the 591 we did get back. More Americans would have been killed and captured if we reopened that war. It was a tough decision for the president, and I think he made the right decision.
Let me just suggest that what you have said then, Ambassador Lord, is internally inconsistent. You can't have it both ways. Either the country would have exploded at any kind of a resumption of war, or had you known about the existence of even a handful of prisoners, you would have gone back to war. You can't have it both ways.
I can't say that we would have gone if we'd known specifics, but I think it would have changed the calculations if you had conclusive proof, is what I'm saying. But I don't think there's any question the country would have exploded if we went back and said, we think they're still holding people, but we can't be sure, so we're going to risk 591 people, we're going to have more prisoners, more people killed, and tear this country apart on evidence that's not conclusive.
We have to take a quick break. Senator McGovern will come right back to you when we continue our discussion in a moment.
things around your house that need batteries. There's one thing that needs a good, fresh battery, most of all. See your Allstate agent for a free home fire safety brochure. And please, check the battery in your smoke detector often.
Families are big, big business, so everybody says theirs is a family car. All right, tell me it has 90 cubic feet of passenger space like a Subaru Legacy then. Enough room for 5 so you're close but not touching me close. Tell me it has a quiet, horizontally opposed engine like the Legacy. There's enough noise already with a family. Tell me it offers all-wheel drive and anti-lock brakes like a Legacy. A family car is for my family, not some other family I don't care so much about. Tell me I have the money. I want to know what to drive.
Gifted Hands, the gallery on the park, downtown A.
Presenting Digital Music Express. 30 channels of CD quality music. The music you want to hear when you want to hear it. DMX comes through your TV cable into your tuner and right into your stereo. And you get all 30 channels for a lot less than you ever thought you'd pay for music. If you like music, you're going to love DMX. Digital Music Express. Just call us today.
Now available in Ames, Nevada, as well as Greater Des Moines.
Just look at oatmeal crisp with raisins. Big flakes bursting with hearty oatmeal baked to a brown sugar crunch, chewy, juicy raisins, and crunchy almonds. So much to savor, no one can race through a bowl. Oatmeal crisp with raisins. The taste that refuses to be rushed. And here's news about Oatmeal Crisp. It's now Oatmeal Crisp with almonds. Twice the almonds for a double crunchy taste. New Oatmeal Crisp with almonds.
He was the proud hero of Desert Storm. Now, for the first time, General Norman Schwarzkopf answers the question, was the Gulf War with 2020 Friday?
And we're back with Winston Lord and George McGovern. Senator McGovern, one more question about the past, and then I'd like to direct both your attentions to the future. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that you had won the 1972 election, and that your chief of intelligence of the Defense Intelligence Agency, let's say, or the CIA, had come to you and said, Mr. President, we did. We left 12, 15, 20, 30 men behind. What would you have done about it?
Well, I think the mistake that President Nixon apparently made, maybe Mr. Lord has a different view of this, is that there was some evidence that we'd left people behind. Even at the time, he was telling the country that all the prisoners were on the way home. So to answer your question, I would not have addressed the American people with an assurance that everybody was home if there was the slightest doubt that we still had Americans in Vietnam. Where I object to Secretary Kissinger and others is that they're still arguing that if he just had the power of bombing, the North Vietnamese and the Laotians would have done what he wanted them to do.
No, if you'll forgive me, Senator, I'm quite clear on what you would not have done.
Right.
You would not have resumed bombing, you would not have gone back into Vietnam, and you also, you say, would not have lied to the American public about it. But what would you have done?
At that stage, the only thing you could do under the circumstances that you've just spelled out is to go the negotiating route. I certainly wouldn't have resumed the war in Vietnam, since that's the thing that put those men in prison in the first place. We'd have just added to the prison list. So that would have been the most self-defeating thing we could have done, and it was impossible politically anyway. The country had had enough of Vietnam. I don't think that Mr. Nixon really had that as a political option. He certainly didn't have it as an option once the Watergate scandal started to unfold.
Ambassador Lord, all too unfortunately, history teaches us that we probably won't be able to escape other wars in the future, and when you have wars, inevitably you have POWs. If the same kind of thing happens in the future, any lessons to be learned, any things that we might do differently, having learned from the Vietnam experience?
Again, if I could comment on the previous exchange, and I'll get to your question. I didn't come here to reopen the debate on the Vietnam War, and Senator McGovern is an honorable man, and I think we should heal the wounds. But I think the record should show that the original Vietnamese position was, you pull out unilaterally, United States, then we'll talk about a ceasefire, how we overthrow the Saigon government, and start talking about your prisoners. We moved them from that position to an agreement that was totally satisfactory, but of course was not implemented. We didn't have the leverage implemented. And with all due respect, Senator McGovern, I'm not being critical, I'm being objective here. At the very time we were doing this, including in October 1972, his position essentially was unilateral withdrawal, then we hope we'll get our prisoners back. And if I'm wrong on that, he can correct me.
Well, I never once, Winston, said a thing about withdrawal without adding subject to the release of our prisoners. That was always part of every formula that I offered for ending the war.
We can go back and look at that, but again, I wasn't here to reopen that. I consider you an honorable man, but I do want to set the record straight on the difficulty of this issue. Now, on your question about future lessons, Ted, I think there are three issues here. One, did we have a good agreement? And this is for future wars as well. Secondly, should we have gone ahead when it wasn't honored? And thirdly, did we explain fully to the American people what was happening? It's on that third point that's still the most troublesome. I've indicated my views on that, but it's clear that over many years, the families and the American people have not felt they've gotten the full story. I do not believe there's been a conspiracy by 5 successive administrations of both parties. I think that's a monstrous charge and wrong, but it's obvious that presumably a better job could have been done in talking to the families and leveling with them, and my heart goes out to them.
Ambassador Lord, Senator McGovern, thank you both very much for joining us. I'll be back in a moment.
Welcome to the 1957 Automobile Show, where you'll see the finest of tomorrow's.
It all started 35 years ago. I'll never forget that day.
David. Gonna go.
It's funny, though. You grow up, raise a family, your priorities change. Of course, there are some priorities that never change. The trick is to make a decision now that you'll be happy with for years to come. When it's all said and done, I think it all goes back to that day 35 years ago.
David, are you out there?
This is your home, you say. You raised us here. You don't want to move across the country. You just put in a dozen tomato plants. But sometimes I think of you, trying to find a light switch in the dark. I think, did you bother making dinner? And I just want to make sure you're okay.
We'll always be there with a savings plan made for you.
Joanne Cern talks about her new Goodyear Aquatred all-season radials.
I was taking my daughter to play rehearsal, and it was pouring.
The advanced Deep Groove Aqua Channel channels water away as you drive.
And the lady in front of me just stopped. And I expected to skid, and I didn't.
Aquatred, only from Goodyear.
And that convinced me right then and there.
Aquatred, we like to say the best tires in the world have Goodyear written all over them.
Buying health insurance on your own on the next Good Morning America, where can you get the best price?
Also, former President Jimmy Carter joins us here on Good Morning America.
The latest news when you need it, overnight, turn to World News Now, later tonight on this ABC station. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
If you wish a videocassette version of Nightline, the cost is $14.98 plus $3.95 shipping and handling. If you wish a printed transcript, please send $4 to 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
Tomorrow, breaking windows gets Brad busted.
They got away, but he was the only one we could catch.
Wasn't trying to break them.
You throw a brick at a window, you expect it to stick? Home improvement. Then, when Dauber 2 times Judy.
If you tell her it didn't mean anything, she'll believe that.
Bury it with a shovel and then bury the shovel.
Coach after home improvement. Tomorrow.
Channel 5's Pam Dale, keeping you in touch.